7.1 Learning A, the beginning of the Cold War. Please add 3 things to each slide. Please pause this. Well, after I get done here, please pause this and add 2 examples for each one of these 2 possible essay questions. Essentially, the exam is going to be split up into 2 parts. One of these 2 objectives will be the application questions, and one will be the essay questions. So, the first one, students will be able to connect the dramatic cultural changes with the larger social shifts in the U.S. So the United States is going to go through massive changes in the post-war period. This unit's called Post-War America, and that's exactly what we'll be looking at, both the political, the foreign policy and then the domestic stuff. Okay, so we've got domestically is this first question. So you've got situations like the Civil Rights Movement, the Red Scare, the United States will start shifting in population from the cities back to the suburbs, which are sort of small living areas that are outside of the big cities. You'll have the rise of teen culture and some rebellion. And you'll also have other movements like the women's movement, and American Indian movement, the Chicano movement, things like that. There's going to be some massive cultural shifts or cultural changes that go alongside the social shifts. The second question is demonstrating how the United States exercises status as a superpower. This is really referencing the foreign policy of the time period. There's going to be a lot of Cold War stuff that we're about to talk about, and these the examples of this are the Vietnam War or the Korean War. Also, you'll have things like the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan that follow through on an American policy of containment. So the United States will belong in NATO and ATO, and will fight against the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviet Union and its allies. So just go ahead and pause and add 2 examples of possible answers or subjects that are within those 2 bullets. All right, so the Cold War. Now, in order for you to understand what the Cold War is, you have to understand who it is. Okay, so the United States and its allies versus the USSR and its allies. The Western Bloc, which is the United States, versus the Eastern Bloc. And yes, those are spelled correctly. Bloc is without a K. So after World War II, these are 2 countries that are the superpowers. When the dust settles, you can see that there are only 2 countries left. The United States, which was fought in the war, but it wasn't fought on its land, so it was able to recover quickly after World War II. And the Soviet Union, which World War II was fought on its land, but it had a remarkable recovery. Both of these countries have massive resources and numbers of people that help them build massive economic become massive economic powers and military powers. So why was it called cold? It's called the Cold War because no shots were actually fired. I mean, I guess there's 2 real reasons why it's called cold. You know, the guns, when they fire, when you shoot a bullet, the gun gets hotter, and when you don't shoot a bullet, it's colder. The barrel's cold. So that's sort of the reference when it talks about the Cold War. It could also be referencing the relationship between the United States and the USSR, which was very cold in nature, meaning that they didn't get along and they were not very nice to each other, and they didn't speak to each other very much. Pause. Okay, the causes of the Cold War. So there's a couple sort of basic causes of the Cold War, and the first one is beliefs. The United States was a democracy. That means the people get to choose their leaders and ultimately the direction that their country goes. It also has a capitalist economy, which means that people, can use their capital, their money in whatever ways that they would like. Of course, the opposite of that is dictatorship, where the government tells the people what to do, and communism, which the government sort of distributes money equally between people, and everybody works for the government. So in the United States is basically about freedom of choice and individual, sinking or swimming as far as life goes as well. So they ultimately fear and dislike dictatorship and communism. You can see here the sort of view on the bottom left of your screen of how the United States viewed the Soviet Union as it's expanding. Soviet Union was communist and dictatorship, and it hated capitalism. The idea that capitalists are sort of money focused and sort of greedy pigs, and would do anything for the dollar. And of course, who has the most power in a capitalist system? Well, it's the rich people. And communism is and socialism are movements for the people, sort of the massive people, which is the majority of them. Go ahead and pause. Also at the root of this conflict are different aims or goals that each side had. The USSR wanted a buffer of satellite nations. Here you can see the countries that make up the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republics. We know them as Soviet Union or the USSR. Number 11, the big one there, is Russia. But it is really, Russia's now just a state within the Soviet Union. The USSR wanted satellite nations or buffer nations in order to prevent another attack from Western Europe, which had happened with Napoleon in the early 1800s, Germany in World War I, and then Germany again in World War II. So they've got issues, and they want to protect themselves. In all three of those conflicts, Russia or the Soviet Union lost the largest number of civilians and soldiers. So they were the ones that probably paid the most. The United States and Western Europe, which includes like Great Britain and France, they've got a conflicting goal. They want to spread democracy. They want to establish trading partners and create a successful world economy. Those two aims are directly in conflict with each other, and thus help spark or continue the rivalry between the United States and the USSR. Pause. The third thing is history. The U.S. and Great Britain had tried to stop the communist revolution during and after World War I. Of course, since they didn't agree with communism, they didn't see the advantages of having a communist government for the first time ever be successful, especially over a large country as Russia or eventually the Soviet Union. The United States and Great Britain gave almost no help to the Soviet Union during World War II militarily. You don't have any American soldiers at Stalingrad, or the United States never, after the invasion of Italy, didn't offer troops to help the Soviet Union push Germany back into its own area. However, the United States did give Soviet Union money in the Lend-Lease Act, so that was a notable exception. The USSR signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact. That allowed Germany to begin World War II without fear of Soviet attack, and this was looked at as a betrayal by the United States and Soviet Union. In fact, you could say that World War II started because of this. Hitler was not afraid of Soviet Union attacking, so they were free to go ahead and attack France through neutral Belgium and Poland. The United States also dropped the atomic bombs in Japan, partly to prove to the Soviet Union that it was very powerful and that the Soviet Union shouldn't mess with it. So this was a really aggressive stance that the Soviet Union took as a threat. Go ahead and pause. So fighting the war, there's basically two different ways that this war was fought. Again, there wasn't bullets that that were fired at each other. The United States and USSR didn't directly attack each other. In fact, there are two different ways. Buildup of weapons and technology are known as the arms race and the space race. It first started out with how many atomic bombs that people had, or that the U.S. had versus the USSR, and then it would go to the hydrogen bombs, and how then it would go to delivery systems, which means that instead of dropping an atomic bomb out of an airplane, then you could have a missile that would shoot over the North Pole, for example, and hit Moscow from the United States. Those are called intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. Also, there was the space race, which was directly related to the arms race. Soviet Union was the first, had the first successful satellite called Sputnik in 1957. They were also the first to put an animal, and then a human in orbit. So the United States felt like there was a space race gap, and so John F. Kennedy famously proclaimed that by the end of the decade, in the 1960s, we would put a man on the moon, and that did come to fruition in 1969 with the first landing on the moon by America, thus sort of winning the space race. Another way was proxy wars. Proxy wars are basically just the United States funding non-communist sides of wars or revolutions, while the Soviet Union would fund or give weapons to the communist or socialist sides in these wars. The examples of this would be would happen in Central and South America, in the Caribbean, also in Africa and in Asia as well. Pause. So after World War II, the USSR refused to allow its occupied countries to have elections. They became communist, thus adding to the spread of communism throughout the world. Of course, the United States and Great Britain really didn't like this. They didn't like the spread of communism. So this division between Eastern and Western Europe would be known as the Iron Curtain. Go ahead and just circle the word Iron Curtain because I'm about to show you where it's at. You can circle that word and draw a line to this slide. You can see where I clumsily wrote Iron Curtain with my mouse here. And you see that the Iron Curtain is a fictional wall. Again, fictional. That means it's not real. That is between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. You can see that there's basically two massive Cold War alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, that were in conflict with each other. I'd like you to please label NATO and Warsaw Pact. I know it's difficult to see the line on your printout, but go ahead and draw the line in there as well. Pause. Okay, now I'm going backwards to how Iron Curtain was actually named. A guy named Winston Churchill, who was the leader of Great Britain, we've discussed him before in class. He was the leader of Great Britain during World War II. He was ousted from his prime ministership right after World War II ended in Europe. But he, in Missouri, gave a famous speech at a college graduation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read it to you and also sort of try to interpret it. So a shadow has fallen upon the scene so lately lighted by the Allied victory. That means something bad's going on, even though we just won the war, World War II. Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its communist international organization intends to do in the immediate future, or what are the limits, if any, to their expansive tendencies. This means the Soviet Union has been expanding communism, and we don't know if they're going to try to continue this. Are they going to fund revolutionaries? Are they going to try to infiltrate, I don't know, the United States or Great Britain or France, other parts of Southern or Eastern Europe or Asia? So Winston Churchill is saying, we have no idea how far they'll go. It is my duty to place before you certain facts about the present position of Europe. That just means I'm going to tell you what's going on in Europe. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, those are just places in Europe, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. So I'd like you to pause and go ahead and write down some of the three of those interpretations of those little small phrases. Pause. Again, this is just a political cartoon. This is just a political cartoon. I'd just like you to write under there, Iron Curtain, this is not real. So the United States had an official response to this aggressiveness, to this lack of communication between this so-called Iron Curtain. So the United States' official policy towards USSR was called containment. The USSR should be stopped expanding, but the United States would not directly attack it. And I often think of a container in the back of your fridge. You know, once you may not know this yet, but eventually you'll be less motivated to clean out your containers, your Tupperware in the back of the fridge because they're so gross. So you sort of just leave them back there because, well, you don't want the smell to get out, and you don't keep putting off cleaning it. That just may be me, but the United States is, leaving USSR as is in the back of the fridge, but it just doesn't want that smell to expand anywhere. Now, Harry S. Truman, in a speech, gave an official gave an official policy. It's called the Truman Doctrine. He announced in a speech that said, essentially, if you are being attacked by communists, or if there's communist revolutionaries in your country, we promise we're going to help you. We'll give you money for sure to help against this communist expansion. So the way that that was carried out is called the Marshall Plan. Almost $13 billion was given to 17 different countries between 1948 and 51. This was to rebuild Europe. Of course, who wants to be communist? Poor people, or countries where there's a lot of devastation and poor people are not able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. So in an effort to contain communism and contain the influence communism has on non-communist countries, the United States gave a lot of money to help rebuild Europe and rebuild the economic stability of each country. Go ahead and pause, add 3 things. Okay, this video here is about the Berlin Blockade. You'll need to take out a blank piece of paper of your own and call it also 7.1 Learning A, Early Cold War. It's number 18 as well. So on this piece of paper, I want you to write Berlin Blockade. That happened in June of 1948. Again, that's June of 1948. So Berlin, if you recall, is in the middle of the Soviet occupied Germany. If you don't remember this, go ahead and go back to go back in this video to the slide where we drew the Iron Curtain. And the very small white spot just above the word East is Berlin, and there's a very small white spot right there, just above the word East on East Germany. That's Berlin, and there were actually American and British and French zones in that area, in that city, based on the end of World War II and the division of Germany. Now, what happened is the 3 zones, the 3 Western countries, combined their zones. In response to that, Soviet Union blockaded that portion of Berlin. This was an attempt to essentially starve out the United States, Great Britain, and France and get them the heck out of the East German area. So in response to that, it wasn't a battle. It wasn't fighting to get to those people. Great Britain and France and the United States launched a Berlin airlift. This would be 11 months from June of 1948 to May of 1949. And basically this was an engineering marvel where planes would launch from different points in the free zone or the western zones and land in Berlin to drop off supplies for the just over 2 million people that lived in that blockaded zone. So eventually the Soviet Union would give in and they would lift their blockade, and this was the first real conflict of the Cold War, and thankfully it did not end in World War III as some people were worried about. So I'd like you to watch this documentary. This is from the British government, and it's sort of advertising the Berlin airlift's success. So please just jot down notes of what I've said about the Berlin airlift blockade and what this video says. At the end of this video, the notes are over, so make sure that you've got these 2 pieces of paper together.
This is a story of the Berlin airlift. The operation carried out by the Royal Air Force and the United States Air Force to supply 2.25 million people of Berlin with food, coal, and other necessities of life. In June 1948, all road and rail communications between the Allied zones and the western sectors of Berlin were closed by the Russians. By the 28th of June, the only way into Berlin was by air, and the first RAF aircraft started this colossal undertaking. According to many predictions, an impossible one to maintain for any length of time, especially during winter. Aircraft began their ceaseless drone into blockaded Berlin, using all available airfields in the western zone. In the first 3 days, 500 landings were achieved, but with the aid of the United States Air Force, the number of flights rose by October to 600 per day. Sunderland flying boats of Coastal Command were ordered in to supplement the land-based planes. These took off from the Elbe at Hamburg and came down on one of Berlin's lakes. Food, Still more food and raw materials had to be poured across the aerial bridge into the blockaded city. Only one narrow corridor led from the base on the Elbe near Hamburg to the unloading base at Havel Lake in the British sector of Berlin. Within 4 days of the decision to use them, the first giant boats, each carrying 5 tons of vital material, were on air transport service.
You are clear to take off, over.
Daily over the port of Hamburg, destination Berlin.
Jolly, jolly sixpence, I've got sixpence to last me all my life. I've tuppence to spend and tuppence to lend and tuppence to send to my wife. No cares have I to with me, no pretty little girl to deceive me. I'm happy as a king.
Past the Olympic Stadium and presently over the only power station left working in the western sector. Immediately on landing, unloading commences and the machines are prepared for the return journey. Return trip, exportable freight was carried, and the opportunity taken to remove some of Berlin's sick children for convalescence. Only the very worst weather kept Allied aircraft out of the sky. Even through storms and mists, the hazardous chain of supply went on. As dusk falls, Sunderlands tie up for the night. Although doing valuable service, the Sunderland's part was small compared to the land-based plane. These indefatigable blockade runners carried on throughout the night and into the dawn. Night and day, week after week, it was a case of more planes, more food, more raw material, shipped without pause from 8 different airfields in the Western Zone. Month after month, the tempo of flights was stepped up, and by Christmas, American and British planes had made 100,000 trips and carried a total of 730,000 tons into Berlin. Even cars were transported. But coal, equally as vital to Berlin as bread, was the greatest load of all. Over 1 million tons have now been flown in. Hundreds of planes of all types and sizes, military and civil, were pressed into service. The RAF York load 9 tons. The Halifax over 6 tons. The Viking over 3 tons. The RAF Dakota 3 tons. The Civil Tudor 8 tons. And what the Berliners call the Grosser Tudor 10 tons. As an additional boost to the airlift, the RAF introduced its Hastings, each carrying over 9 tons. At the 3 airports in Berlin, Gatow, Tempelhof, and Tegel, aircraft were landing or taking off every 90 seconds. Many notabilities visited Berlin to see the workings of this magnificent achievement and to praise the great work of the British and American ground and air personnel. Chief of the Air Staff, Lord Tedder, and the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Bevin, whose diplomacy was much aided by the success of the airlift. He added his tribute when he visited Berlin on the eve of the lifting of the blockade in May 1949. For 10 whole months, a ceaseless stream of Allied aircraft landed in Berlin, where Germans, supervised by British Army personnel, eagerly unloaded the vital supplies. Air crews of the RAF and Commonwealth crews from Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, together with their British charter colleagues, all of them played their part with the United States Air Force in maintaining this non-stop operation. A combined operation which on one day landed in Berlin a record load of nearly 13,000 tons. That is equivalent to the normal tonnage moved daily by surface transport before the blockade. Newsprint for Berlin's democratic press comes in. Mail for the outside world goes out.